I am preparing an article on the occasion of Hantaï's show in Paris and New York that focuses on his decision to stop exhibiting his work in the early 80s. Since I never had the occasion to meet him, and you were a good friend of his, I wanted to speak with you about this period of his life and work to better understand, if possible, such a drastic decision for an artist at the peak of his career.
So, I guess I met him in the late 70s. And actually, I can't remember exactly when. But I went to the Jean Fournier Gallery. And I spoke with Jean Fournier. And he was at a vernissage, and he pointed Hantaï out to me and said, well, that's him over there. And so I went over and said hello, and he invited me to his house, and we entered into a conversation which ended up lasting for 30 years.
So when you met him, that was in the early 80s, just before he stopped working?
It was the late 70s.
Late 70s, okay.
Because I came here in 1980.
Okay.
So I met him in 78 or something like that.
Right.
And maybe even 77. Probably more like 77. Anyway. So I was around throughout that whole period, in the time when he stopped writing, stopped showing. And so I was very much privy to his thinking at that time.
Right.
And indeed, when Simon died, and the economic world virtually collapsed in 2008, I wrote a text about exactly the subject you're talking about. Because I thought it was important that his point of view should be known. Mm-hmm. And I understood, of course, that for many people it was very confusing.
Right.
And so, there are two essential issues at stake in Hantaï's decision to withdraw from the commercial exhibition of his work. The first is the immediately commercial aspect, and that's very simple to understand. It had been building throughout the 70s, but by 1980 there was a sense that a new commercial art market had taken control.
Right.
It was based in New York, and it was based in it had become a commercial system, which was being driven by dealers, auction houses, and collectors. Writers and intellectual aesthetic discourse had been very seriously, diminished. The artists themselves had become producers of this machine.
Right.
And therefore, of course, artists were looking for the product which they knew that would be well received in order to make work which would be successful.
Right.
And secondarily, the system which selects artists was selecting artists who were making the kind of work that they knew their clients would want to buy.
Right.
So Hantaï was very clear about this, that the intellectual and aesthetic independence of modern art could only be sacrificed to this commercial imperative.
Right.
And that indeed the consumers of art, the buyers of art, ultimately the collectors, where the money was, they would determine the kind of art which would come forward and be recognized and be honored and be successful and be shown.
Right.
And he felt that would lead to the death or the collapse of modern art, which he was extremely closely attached.
Right.
So, his view of art was the progression of great modern art from the early 19th century. And I would run the names off of Géricault and Courbet and Manet and Cézanne and, of course, many others. And then, of course, moving in the 20th century, Picasso, Matisse, Bonnard, but, of course, many others. But it was a historical tradition of aesthetic and intellectual integrity.
Right.
And it led up to the American painters, with a particular, most immediate focus for Hantaï, of course, was the painters of the 40s and 50s in New York, and most notably Pollock, but also Rothko and Newman and others again. So for him there was this tradition of aesthetic and intellectual integrity, and that's what he sought to build upon.
Right.
And he saw that in the commercial art world, as it was emerging, as it had been emerging since the 60s, but it was really coming into its maturity in the 80s, he saw that would no longer be possible, that work would get lost. And he felt that he needed to protect the integrity of his work, and the only way he could was by controlling the supply.
I see.
So that was point one, and it was very clear, and he expressed it to me as such. But there's a much more interesting reason for his point of view, which is equally true, and that he also discussed very fully and clearly with me. And we had, as I say, 30 years of broad, general, intellectual discussion backwards and forwards about all of these issues. So the second issue was that he felt that indeed a problem in the tradition of modern art had taken shape independently of and even prior to this whole market development.
Right.
And that was a problem in the intellectual and aesthetic evaluation of art. It was a problem of criticism.
Right.
And I guess he would probably have identified it. Certainly I now would identify what he and I were talking about clearly as being the problems surrounding what we call formalist criticism.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose one has to evoke the name of Clement Greenberg because he was so influential. But of course, he was not alone. There was a whole body of thinking. And this thinking about art takes the form of what is called modernism.
Mm-hmm.
I never heard Hantaï use the term modernist in my life.
Uh-huh. I
I don't think he thought of himself as a modernist. In fact, I assert he did not think of himself as a modernist. He thought of himself as a modern artist.
Right.
Now today, we use the term modern art and modernist art as synonyms, as being the same thing, as being equivalent.
Yeah.
But I personally myself do not think they are the equivalent. I think they're different entities, different animals, and I'm sure that Hantaï felt the same way.
Mm-hmm.
What he was interested in, as I say, was the tradition of modern art. And he was interested in the intellectual and aesthetic content of modern art. And he always understood that modern art, was engaged in real experience and the dilemmas and the struggle and the challenge of man living in a society, in a history, in a context of, and in a history of intellectual thought, philosophical, literary, scientific, all that you care to imagine.
Right.
And so he situated his work in that context. He thought of it as functioning in that context. And he thought that to present his work as modernist art involved in the preoccupations of modernist criticism was a complete betrayal of what his work stood for.
Right.
So this was even more important than the commercial aspect to him.
Right.
And so he felt that, again, until that problem could be clarified, he would rather his work was not seen. He would rather keep it all out of people's view, so as to force, hopefully, at some later stage, the need to come and raise these questions and ask these questions that you're asking now.
Right.
And then he hoped the story would be told.
Right.
And I think he hoped it would be told by people like me that he spent a lot of time with, discussing these issues with, and knowing that I shared his point of view.
Right.
And in effect, that's exactly what is happening today, And that's why I have written a number of texts myself since his death, because I knew it was now the time to tell that story.
Right.
So I wrote in 98, I think, a short essay. It's only 5 pages, but it explores the relationship between Hantaï and Pollock. But it also situates this debate between about Pollock and Hantaï in a triangular relationship with Robert Smithson, the great American sculptor.
Yeah.
Now, people automatically would not think of a relation between Hantaï and Smithson.
Right.
But I believe there is one, a very strong one. It's founded on two things. Founded, first of all, on an awareness of, an interest of, a concern with the issues that Jackson Pollock's work produces. I think that if you read Smithson's writing, you will see that he was deeply concerned with the intellectual issues that Pollock raises in his work. And then secondarily, I think there's a profound point of contact between Hantaï and Smithson in that they were both readers of Georges Bataille's philosophy. And I think that Smithson was certainly one of the earliest, perhaps the earliest serious major figure in America to read Bataille. He got the first book of essays that was translated. It's in his library, and that's documented as having been in his library. And it's clear that from reading Smithson that he was deeply influenced by Bataille. He didn't read a lot probably of him, but he read enough to get the message. And of course, Hantaï's thought was completely engaged with Bataille throughout his entire career, from the 50s onwards. So I make that case. So that was one text I wrote. I think it exists. And then for the show I did 2 years ago, I wrote a longer text where I situate him in relationship to Andy Warhol, but that I also write about the overview of Pollock's relationship with Hantaï's relationship with Pollock, and going back to Cézanne and Matisse as the major figures, and of course relating him to American and international art of the 60s and 70s, minimalism, etc. So all that was dealt with in that essay. Carter Ratcliffe also deals with those issues from his own point of view in his essay, which I commissioned a couple of years prior. And that essay was developed in an intellectual exchange between Carter and myself, because we worked on it. I worked on it as an editor, he wrote the piece. But anyway, I wrote those things because I felt that I had a responsibility to Hantaï as a friend and as an artist I admired, to tell the story of his position on these issues. When the time came, and as the retrospective was coming up, I felt it was now, it had to be done.
Now, my question to you as a person who knew Hantaï during those years where he was, basically withdrawn from the scene, and his work was not seen for, a good 10 years, pretty much. Did he actually stop painting, or was he continuing to paint but not showing? What's the difference there between in his decision not to work, not to show anymore? Was it just not to show, or was it not to work and to show? Or was he still working privately, secretly in his studio?
He basically withdrew.
Which I think he was, right?
Well, he basically withdrew in '83, and he did not show again until the exhibition in the Espace Rennes in the Rue de Lille, I think we have to correct the verified dates, but I think that was 98. So it's actually 15 years. There was 15 solid years in which he did not exhibit commercially, or indeed exhibit publicly, because except for what the museum was showing of the history of his work from the past. So that is a true fact of his biography. To answer your question, I think it is it is complicated. It's not. It's a little less clear to answer than the answers that I gave earlier about why he withdrew. To answer in brief, there was a painting project, which he was engaged on around the time that he stopped, and that project exists, a large body of work, which has never been seen. So that's an issue for the estate and for posterity to deal with at some point. And then, of course, in the 90s, there was the whole question of this series of paintings called the Laissés, which there's one in my exhibition.
I noticed that,
so you're familiar with that story, and so that then became the last and major body of his work. But in between, there was a large period of time when one could say that he was not painting, but I think that is to completely misunderstand his understanding of what it was to paint,
right,
and what it was to be a painter. And again, going back to my remarks and my comments earlier about the issues he had with our contemporary art world, he again had the firm view that being a painter was not just the physical activity of applying paint with a brush onto canvas. In fact, he thought that was the problem, that in fact we had begun to think of the activity of painting as some form of physical production, which was supplying a supply need, a need of supply. And so he felt, in fact, that these painters who were just making work for the market were not painting at all. So he felt, how can I go on painting? The issue for him was not to stop painting. The issue for him was, how do I go on being a painter in this circumstance? How do I go on being a genuine painter with integrity? How do I keep my painting alive in my mind and in the mind of my viewers? That was his problem. That's why he stopped in 1983, and that's why he kept that position. And so he insisted in his that the act of painting was many things, but one of them was the intellectual reflection, consideration, and exploration of what it means to paint and what painting means. And so that became a major focus of his time in those years. But I don't think for a moment he thought he wasn't painting. He thought that's what it took to be a painter today. That's what it took to paint. And if you look at his career, this is not an artist who had difficulty making work. I mean, when I say difficulty, it's not an artist who was unable to make work. He made extraordinary amount of work. And he worked in his series, he worked intensely, and he put out enormous amounts of actual physical painting when he was painting. But it was always interspersed by periods of meditation, contemplation, repose, when he stood back. And it was out of those periods of gestation that these new series emerged, and he moved the whole endeavor of his oeuvre forward. If you he had his mid-career show at the Musée Moderne, which was that time was housed on the Avenue Président Wilson in 1976. 1976. So he had just made his first series of tabular paintings. Made them from 70s. The earliest that I ever saw were in 72, but he didn't really start till 74. 74 through 76 were the tabular, the first series.
I remember that show.
You remember the show?
Yeah.
Good. So, but he stopped. The show interrupted his process, and he'd also made that series, and he made the film with Jean-Michel Meurice. And that interrupted his intellectual and his creative process, and he didn't paint for 5 years, between 76 and 80, 4 years. These dates are soft, I don't know exactly, but 70s to 80. He had a fallow period, not related to directly to the issues I discussed earlier, but I think directly, he told me that he found making the film was a very disturbing thing for him, and basically he regretted having done it, because it interrupted his creative process. And he said to me once, "Il faut jamais faire ça, Paul." But it was done, and of course the film is a very important document, so we're very happy to have it. But it did cost him a lot in the creative process. So for 4 years there, he did a painting, and then he came back in and made his second series of tabular paintings, the second series, and then he made the tabular lila, and he made a number of other things. So he had an enormous burst of energy in 80 onwards. But he'd gone through this 4 years, and if you look back at his career, there are other short periods when
he was in between.
Did not work. But in 83, he was in his 60s at that point. He was born in 22, so he's 61, 62. And he was confronting these issues that I talked to you about earlier, and he was seriously disaffected and seriously concerned about future for his work, but also the future for the project of modern painting in large. Yeah. And he felt he had to do something drastic, and so he took the approach he took. Right. I personally believe that he did the right thing. I think I shared all those years with him. These were extraordinarily productive years. He was extremely engaged, active, thinking about all these issues. Much of how he communicated, much of what he told me about his work was put in place during that time. He was engaged with broad projects of reading and exchange with other philosophers.
Right, he was reading a lot of philosophy.
Yep, so all of this was extremely active and positive, and frankly, I think an essential element of his biography, of his story, and it made possible the last series of paintings, the Laissés, which I think are very great works. They're very austere. They will take a while for people to come to understand, but they are a grand vision, and they're a late vision of his work, and they complete his vision and complete his work in an extraordinary manner. And they had to be made, they had to be thought through and invented. There's a tremendous shift between that work and the tabulas before, with the 15-year gap. And so if he hadn't lived his life the way he did and made the decisions he did, we would not, I'm sure, have those late paintings today. Right. So there's nothing to be regretted, and there's actually nothing that cannot be understood. In fact, it's an extremely lucid and coherent story, which testifies, bears witness to an artist of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary integrity.
So to come back to Les Laissés, the way I understand it, maybe I only have partial information there, is that they were made out of some fragments or cutouts of tabulas. Yes. And then buried in his garden, and then unearthed a few years later.
Not exactly, no. It's a little simpler than that. As he came towards the end of the second tabular series, he decided to make paintings of enormous size, démesuré, you know?
Right.
I always speak from extempore, but I'm thinking sort of like 30 to 50 feet. That's in our way of measuring here in America. 30 to 50 feet. I always have 10 by 15 meter page. Right. I can show you a picture there where there's a picture, and they were shown in the CAPC in Bordeaux.
Yeah.
And there are pictures of the paintings in the arcs of the CAPC, and you can see people standing, and they're about that size to the painting, which is that size. So he made that series of works, and I don't know exactly what he felt about those paintings. He was rather discreet about it. I don't want to say regarding what he thought and what he said more than I know. I'd rather say I don't know rather than put words in his mouth. But I tell you what he did say to me was that when he looked at them, in retrospect, he felt there was no need for so many of them.
Right.
And he also intimated to me that the society in which he lived, the society of the time, did not have a place for such paintings.
Right.
And so he felt there was a mismatch between these works and the social host that would receive them. And he could have just set them aside and kept them, but he decided that he wanted to, he didn't want to leave that open to posterity, to find these paintings later on and try and make out how to deal with them or what to think of them. He decided he wanted to make the decision himself now while he was there.
Right.
So he decided that he would destroy them, but not all of them. He told me at the time that he was keeping one or two. He didn't, again, say more than that. He didn't like to tie himself down, but he said, I'm keeping one or two, but the rest I am destroying, as he told me. So then what happened? He took them out to his country house in the garden. There are pictures of him doing this. Antonio Semeraro was there, took pictures of him.
I know him.
Yeah. I actually never met Antonio.
Oh, yeah?
One of the few people I never met.
Right.
I regret that. I would like to have met him, but somehow we never did. And then I was more here in America after that. So anyway, so he cut them up, and there's documentation about exactly what he did.
Right.
And he folded them up, and he buried them in compost in the back of the garden to rot, to be destroyed.
Right.
But as he was doing it, he saw that some of the sections that were cut out functioned quite differently and in a very interesting manner from the host painting from which they had been cut.
Right.
And he began to see that for him, they had their own integrity as new and independent, fresh works. So they weren't, he called them laissés, left over from the big paintings, but he didn't think of them as fragments of the big paintings. He thought of them as new, fresh, and independent paintings in their own right. He wanted their origins coming out of the big paintings to be preserved, and that's why he called them laissés. I've called them leftovers. And he dated them from the 81 when they were originally painted in the large format to /94 when they were cut up, to give this sense of time. I think it's also very clear that he thought of these paintings as the production of these 15 years, that all of the thought process going on throughout those years had been necessary in order to get to that point. So he thought of himself as having been making those paintings probably in his sleep for those 15 years. They were actually physically cut up in the duration of a summer, or maybe a summer and the following spring. He may have worked on it into a second year. That could be verified. I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, so they were cut up, and he saw them as having an integrity and a fresh identity of their own. And I can tell you the further thought that he had in his mind when he was evaluating them aesthetically. He saw them very much as an investigation of scale, because they were coming, these forms, as we see them now, it's like one big square from one of these large paintings, and there would have been 6 across and 4 down, and we just take one. So the first thing you have to bear in mind is that what was his relationship with the format of the canvas when he was painting them originally in 81, when they were 10 by 16 or 18 meters, or whatever they were. Okay? You have a certain, the painter, the artist, has a certain relationship with that size of work, and you have to have a certain rapport or technical rapport in painting them. And in his case, of course, he painted them with a brush, with a large commercial brush with a long handle. So he was like sweeping the floor, and you can see that in the quality of the brushstroke, or whether in the quality of the painting, you can see it. It doesn't have the same focus and intensity of vision that an earlier tabula would have had. What we call the quality had been adjusted. Now, it's not that the quality is bad; the quality has been shifted under the determination of his relationship to the canvas, which was absolutely out of scale. However, when he cuts those pieces out, and you come back down to one single form, then the relationship of the body is totally different. The relationship, of course, of the artist and his mind and body, but also the viewers. And what you really get is a sense of implosion, of collapse. You've got to imagine this. The Hantaï's technique of folding was an initial collapse of the material of the canvas by the fold, and then an expansion, an opening up of the canvas when he opens it up and stretches it. So this dynamic of collapsing and expanding is absolutely fundamental to the whole rhythm of his work, all the way through. And here one more time, you have it, but functioning in a different way. He's not folding, he's cutting out sections and taking them out of the larger format of the large paintings. And so the scale collapses, and you get a whole different relationship with the body from what you had before. So I think when you look at those paintings with all of that in mind, and he said all of this to me, I'm not inventing this It's not my own. These are not my own ideas. He said this is the way he understood it.
Right.
And I think when you think about it, the way he explained it to me there, I think it makes sense in an extraordinary way. And these paintings take on an identity quite separate from all his previous work. And in some sense, in some way, they are the, as I say, the completion of his vision.
Right. Right. That's interesting. The last thing I wanted to ask you, as a person who knew him while this sort of hiatus in his work was going on, is how did he live it? Was it something that he lived, with difficulty, or did he live that period of interruption, or is because he comes across as somebody who is so involved. I mean, you look at his production and the intensity of the work, the physical work, involved in doing those paintings. And he did. When you look at this studio, photos of his studios, there's dozens and dozens of them around. So he was working all the time. He was overproducing in a certain way.
Yeah.
Even though he was not feeding a market, he was definitely a big producer. So how did that work out? I mean, in his life, how, as a painter, did he, live this kind of withdrawing from an action or an activity that was so important, so involved until then?
I would confirm my own impressions of Simon Hantaï as an artist in confirming what you've just said, which is that I would say when we look at the great artists of the 20th century, Hantaï will come across as one of the most intellectually and physically powerful, energetic, engaging of all great masters.
Right.
And that played out in an extraordinary productive drive, as you say,
Right.
overproducing
Right.
to some extent. As a reader of Georges Bataille,
Right.
he was very, very aware of the whole dimension of excess.
Yeah, he was
in
totally
human
into
life.
that.
Completely understood all of this,
Right.
and felt it in his own life and in
Right.
his own energy.
Right. Ever since his surrealist days, actually, if you look at the paintings, like Hommage à Jean-Pierre Brisset, there's excess everywhere.
Yeah. So, that is something that needs to be explored. I mean, I have stressed in my text the relationship with Bataille and
Right.
how Bataille is, but I've said that Bataille is essential for understanding the second half of modern art. I think after all, Bataille places the sun at the center of his theory of economy.
Right.
And who places the sun at the center of his aesthetic vision? Above all, Cézanne.
Right.
We can say that Monet did too, but the impression in general.
Right.
But Cézanne was the intellectual giant of that whole tradition. And Cézanne it goes down to Aix-en-Provence, where people didn't go in the Victorian age or in the 19th century because it was too hot and there was no air conditioning.
Right.
And he went down and he confronted that force of nature in his work, and so that relation. So Bataille is already anchored in Cézanne, although Bataille didn't really consider Cézanne, and art historians don't want to consider Bataille. So we have this mismatch all around.
Right.
For me, it's essential that you cannot understand 20th century art without understanding the companion philosopher, which Bataille was to those arts. For Cézanne. For the American artists too, and for Hantaï, and certainly for Smithson too. So that's essential. So this whole question of excess is fundamental to the economy, the aesthetic economy of Hantaï's painting. So to come back to your question of how he lived those 15 years, again. I don't want to misspeak or oversimplify or mislead. I'd rather say nothing than do that. It's a complicated, difficult question to evaluate, even for me who was there. And of course, I wasn't the only one there, so there were the other witnesses of all these matters, happily. But I was there to a great extent, and I definitely, throughout much, if not most of that time, was probably one of the principal interlocutors for him. And so I surely have the experience to answer your question. The actual answer itself, I have to think carefully, because Hantaï's evaluation of the situation, which I gave you at the beginning of this interview, clearly did not please him. He was clearly troubled by the state of the art world in its commercial dimension as it had developed. And he was also clearly very frustrated by the art historical and critical conventions which had grown up around the notion of modernism, which he completely disagreed with. And so these were matters of contention and dissatisfaction for him. He was taking steps to protect himself against this social context, an intellectual context. So there was that element of it, and that was present in his thinking and in his conversation. So there was dissatisfaction. But at the same time, he had made this transition. He'd already always had in his mind this understanding of the equation between painting production and intellectual reflection, and he understood that one was the equivalent of the other using different means, and so he was happy to pursue his body, his work in this new fashion to a great extent, and so there was never any element of
I was thinking frustration,
Some element of frustration was there with the dissatisfaction with the world, but when he withdrew from the world, he withdrew physically, he didn't withdraw intellectually. He remained very engaged with everything that was going on. And of course, he only saw certain people, but anyone who wanted to see him could see him. Anyone who had the motivation and had the legitimate interest to seek out Simon Hantaï and talk to him, he was open to that engagement. He wasn't interested in social, or socializing or in fashionable exchange. But he was not someone who was defensive with people. He was very direct, and he was. During those years, he was in a very active, combative, engaged state of mind. I would never say that it was touched by anything which you could relate to depression or something like that. That he never succumbed to that. He was a man of very strong will and strong habits. So he did not indulge in any of the activities that often will undermine artists. One can think of Pollock under stress, social strain. He was able to assume all of those issues. He could deal with all of that, and so during this time he remained an extremely active, productive, engaged person.
So would you, just to sum up a little bit on this period, would you characterize his attitude as an attitude of resistance or opposition, or I have a feeling that it's more a question of resistance than resistance to a state of things that he didn't approve of.
Yes, he was unnegotiable on the issues involving the aesthetic and intellectual content of the tradition of modern art, and he believed in the project of modern art, and he believed it was still valid, viable, and active in the second half of the 20th century, in spite of the social consensus.
Yeah.
And he was resistant, to and defiant of that new social consensus which we saw emerging in the international contemporary art world.
Which is ruling us today.
Yes, exactly. That said, he was about the positive solution. I always say that in the art world, there's a certain amount of very smart people going around who know what's wrong with the situation, but they don't know what's right. And they miss what's right. Hantaï was not, he made his evaluation of what was wrong, he was very clear about it, but that wasn't where his energies went. He wanted to support his own body of work, what he was doing, and he believed that was the right path to go on. And he remained a very positive person. He stood for something. Part of what he stood for was rejection of its opposite, or rejection of the situation. So yes, there was resistance, but he was actually, the emphasis was always on positively standing for for the aesthetic and intellectual vision that he had developed and found and worked on and developed and created over all this time. He knew he had a major legacy to leave, and he wanted to protect it. He wanted to give it a shot at survival. And, he said to me, something will always survive. He didn't say that his own body of work would survive. He thought he didn't rule out that he might be forgotten for 50 years or 100 years, but he said that something always survives.
Thank you so much for spending the time reminiscing about your personal friendship with Hantaï, and for clarifying the finer details of his artistic stance in his refusal to participate in the new contemporary commercial art scene. Thanks again.